Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Well, No Man's Sky is finally out, and I think that it is not unfair to say that it would have been absolutely impossible to live up to the expectations that had been raised for this particular title. No matter how hard the developers had worked, and no matter how good the game was, it still would not have reached the, in my view, impossible expectations of certain gamers. It's been an interesting few years, a road that has led us to this point when it comes to No Man's Sky. From its initial unveiling at VGX in 2013, all the way through to its 2016 release after multiple delays, the hype train frankly going off the rails, and the anticipation reaching unprecedented levels. Is it unfair to say that? No, I don't think it is unfair to say that. I have never ever seen anticipation be this high for a video game. The comparison to Spore is apt on multiple levels, because I think that's the only title in recent memory that was close. And it's certainly an appropriate comparison, considering both games feature an interesting comparison of scope, as well as certain features and design goals. It is, however, clear, a week or so after its release, that No Man's Sky has been met with a middling response, whether it be from critics or from actual gamers, and the whole process has been an explosion of emotion on all sides. Got to be one of the most vicious, one of the most hardline, and one of the most divisive discussions that I've seen online about a game at any point during the industry's life cycle. I've never seen anything get this bad. And I want to look at why. I want to think about why exactly we got to this point. I suppose who is responsible for it, and whether or not it's possible to mitigate that in the future. Indeed, whether or not a company would want to mitigate that in the future. Because, let's be frank, the runaway hype train can be very beneficial to games companies, as we've seen already through the sales figures of No Man's Sky. So let's go back. It was initially unveiled at the VGX in 2013, a relatively short trailer consisting of a lot of incredibly short cuts and one specific sequence of, well, basically walking along the side of a coast on an alien planet. The trailer promised literally the universe. Its first claim was that every atom was procedurally generated, which, of course, we now know was clearly not true and was a fairly ridiculous proposition from the get-go, but hey, that's what it actually said. And outside of that, it promised an entire unexplored universe for you to look at. Various shots of various different planets, as well as a couple of very short clips of supposed space combat sequences, accompanied a rather thrilling soundtrack, and of course the promise of perhaps the best game ever. This was met with a great deal of acclaim. The VGX show was never particularly good to begin with. The 2013 awards show was, of course, the last Spike Video Game Awards show before Jeff Keighley went and did his own show, the Game Awards, which premiered in 2014. And No Man's Sky stood out amongst some fairly middling unveils and premieres on the show, which included Tales from the Borderlands, the definitive edition of Tomb Raider, the Telltale version of Game of Thrones, as well as an inexplicably pay-to-win mobile game from Remedy, which was a little bit weird, called Agents of Storm. That is still around, although certainly not very popular. Despite a number of content reveals for some very high-profile games, such as South Park: The Stick of Truth and Titanfall, No Man's Sky didn't really have too much trouble distinguishing itself amongst the actual premieres, because there really wasn't an awful lot going on that year. Unsurprisingly, and perhaps understandably, the game's press went absolutely crazy for No Man's Sky immediately upon its debut. Kotaku penned an article, "Wow, No Man's Sky just stole the show." Game Rant claims that No Man's Sky is the most exciting reveal of the Spike Video Game Awards, which, to be fair, they're probably right, considering there weren't all that many other reveals that year anyway. Rock Paper Shotgun declared, "Whatever you do, watch this," gushing in praise over this 1-minute trailer of a game that didn't exist yet. The hype train was in motion, and you can't really blame Hello Games for taking full advantage of that. They're a fairly small, UK-based studio, their only previous titles being the 2 Joe Danger games, both of which I enjoyed a great deal. So to get this level of publicity right off the bat is a huge PR win. You could also perhaps argue that it's not unreasonable for the games press to start hyping up a game at this point, as long as they decide to be skeptical later down the line. Of course, we know that didn't really happen in hindsight. Sites were more than happy to ride the hype train up until launch, clicks of course equaling cash for those particular outlets. And as the fervor around this particular game grew, the likelihood of any real skepticism or criticism coming from these sites lessened as it became abundantly clear that the hostility that they would receive amongst the game's more zealous fans would be very unpleasant indeed. A similar story occurred during E3 of 2014 with the next showing of No Man's Sky, accompanied again by articles lavishing praise upon the title. Even a BBC Technology article stated that No Man's Sky took on the games industry and won at E3 in 2014, and this article in particular shows the sheer amount of hype that was being generated by games press and personalities at the time. The article showcases social media postings from influential people within the games industry, such as the editor-in-chief of Kotaku, the founder of Verge, the creator of Watch Dogs, as well as Amazon's video games division, stating, in no particular order, "Okay, I want to play No Man's Sky like yesterday. No Man's Sky looks incredible. Can't wait to get my hands on it. No Man's Sky looks phenomenal. Best looking game of the day so far. I am freaking out about No Man's Sky." Bear in mind at this point that E3 2014 featured approximately 5 minutes of footage in total for No Man's Sky. This was a 2.5 or so minute presentation on the stage with Sean Murray at the PlayStation press conference, as well as a 3-minute trailer published on the PlayStation YouTube channel. This is after, of course, Sony had picked up the game, bearing in mind that the initial unveil of No Man's Sky had indicated that this was actually a PC title, first and foremost. This amount of hype surrounding a game is not completely unusual, especially around E3. The competition to see who will win E3 is a hot debate amongst people on the internet for some reason. And of course, the sheer number of awards, completely fake and meaningless awards that are given out at E3 is beyond ridiculous. Various sites carried the news that the Games Critic Awards of 2014 had awarded No Man's Sky the Best Original Game, as well as Best Independent Game and Special Commendation for Innovation. But who are the people behind the Game Critics Awards, you might ask? Well, according to the website, they're an independent group of 40 global media outlets which cover the video games industry. The list of those participating is actually massive. Ars Technica, Destructoid, EGM, Electric Playground, Games Radar, GameSpot, Giant Bomb, IGN, the LA Times, Mashable, as well as international publications such as Edge, Eurogamer, and various foreign language organizations. Yes, this apparently exists, and this would also explain as to why this news got around pretty much everywhere, because the award was essentially given out by most of the major traditional media outlets in the games industry. That's not to mention the myriad of independent organization awards that are given out every single year, many of which landed on No Man's Sky. It was essentially showered in praise and awards, despite being more than 2 years away from release, with a huge list of unanswered questions as regards to what the core gameplay loop would involve, or how the various vague systems within this supposedly infinite game would actually work. The few interviews given by Sean Murray at the time were horrendously vague, and honestly, it seemed like none of the outlets covering the game had any interest in pressing the issue with Hello Games and asking exactly how all of this would function in a real environment. It was around this point that I think the amount of misinformation and filling in the blanks really started to run wild. I was reading this BBC article and I found something very interesting. The article featured a piece of concept art stating that the intention is that the final game will allow players to chase each other through canyons. This, of course, being a very, very strong indicator that the game was intended to have some sort of meaningful multiplayer, and this wasn't really something that was denied an awful lot by the creators. You'll find various interviews with Sean Murray with supposedly contradictory statements, although most of them seem to maintain a particular theme. The idea that the universe is so big that the likelihood is you will never meet another person, but then saying it is actually possible to meet another player within the world. Of course, up to this point, as far as we are aware, that has never actually happened, and there is no indication that this functionality within the game actually exists. Attempts by streamers to meet up at planets within the same area of the universe have been met with failure, and I do not believe I've seen a single piece of evidence, right now at any rate, that any player has come across any other player during their play session within No Man's Sky. But yet the expectations seem to be there anyway, which is a little bit strange, considering that as far as I am aware, Hello Games never claimed that this would be specifically a multiplayer title. A quote from Sean Murray, in fact, multiplayer is not a thing people should be thinking about going into the game. Regardless of this, he had stated on multiple occasions that while it would be incredibly rare, it would actually be possible to meet other players, which seems to have set people's imaginations running wild and set expectations that Hello Games never obviously intended to fulfill in the first place. Sean compared the game in an interview to Dark Souls and Journey. However, he was fairly vague in terms of the actual specifics. He did not specifically say that there would be Dark Souls or Journey-like mechanics when it came to the multiplayer, but he said that he wanted people to have a sense that a player had been there prior to them, which really means absolutely nothing, as is going to be a theme amongst many of the statements made by Sean Murray and representatives of Hello Games when it comes to pre-release information regarding No Man's Sky. Within the very same interview that I found the multiplayer quote, we had Sean Murray basically refusing to confirm or deny anything in regards to any sort of multiplayer functionality. He kept repeatedly saying that that's not what people should be thinking about, but he didn't flat out say, no, there's no multiplayer aspect at all, which would have made an awful lot more sense, and it's frankly bizarre that he would be so evasive on this particular subject rather than simply stating a straight yes or no answer. There's so many instances of that being the case, and I have a feeling that that is one of the reasons that the hype for this game got to stratospheric levels. The sheer, vague, evasive answers of Sean Murray and the Hello Games team. And yes, I would put some blame on them for that. I think that they have fueled the unrealistic expectations of their game, and as a direct result, they have perhaps been punished for that, but that punishment comes in the form of angry people on the internet. It certainly did not come in the form of low pre-order figures. Make no mistake about it, No Man's Sky was pre-ordered to hell and back even on PC, despite doubts about the efficacy of the PC version, which as it turned out were very well founded indeed, as the game ran incredibly poorly on many people's systems at launch and continues to have those very same problems at the time of the creation of this video. Unfortunately, amongst the vagaries, there are things which could be considered specifics, and some of these specifics appear to be outright lies. An interview from 2015 with Eurogamer's Dan Silver revealed the following quote from Sean Murray. And as they go, they're upgrading their ship, they're upgrading their weapons, they're upgrading their suit, and they need to do that because they're very vulnerable. They will be attacked by AI, potentially, very rarely, other players, things like that, if you cross paths with them. That seems to me like a confirmation of PvP combat. You could argue that that's fairly vague, but I don't see what other way you could possibly interpret it. And as a result, of course, people ran with that. DM21 Gaming has a video with 106,000 views stating No Man's Sky PvP confirmed, which of course seems to be completely false. But let's be honest, they were basing it on that Eurogamer quote, and that did come directly from the mouth of Sean Murray himself. Videos sprung up all over YouTube as a result of that one particular quote. No Man's Sky, a closer look at PvP. No Man's Sky PvP multiplayer community, of course something which is utterly impossible. Amazing No Man's Sky facts, and so on and so forth. Now maybe you can blame these publishers for taking a quote and running with it, but that quote still exists. There's no doubt about that. That is a real quote on a real website in a real interview, and it's a perfect example of some of the vagaries and slips of the tongue which resulted in some of the massive expectations that were put on the back of this particular game. You can, certainly, without a doubt, blame some gamers for filling in the gaps excessively. There's nothing wrong with speculating about what a game may contain, or indeed putting up a wish list, fantasizing about what a game may involve. But I think there's a huge difference between games that never really encourage you to do that in the first place, and games which seem to have actively encouraged that behavior as a result of the PR and marketing that was done for that game by the company themselves. I wouldn't even blame Sony for blowing this stuff out of proportion. Yes, they promoted the game, they're involved in the marketing, but these are quotes that came from Hello Games. They did not come from Sony. And people have been piecing together information about this game for years. I complained a couple of years ago that we just didn't really know anything about No Man's Sky, and people were very happy to point out that actually, yes, we did, that there were entire wikis compiled of speculation based on small quotes from individual interviews from Sean Murray and those from Hello Games. So they built this picture based on the very limited information that they had, and the picture ended up being, in many ways, very much false. How much of that was actual wishful thinking, and how much of it was grounded in real quotes and things that were mentioned perhaps only once in interviews with the developers? Well, it would take a very long time to sift through every single piece of information and find that out. After all, we are talking about a game that is the size of a universe. There is a lot of information, a lot of systems working together, and little secrets and things that could very well happen, things that could very well not have even been discovered yet. And that brings me on to a very important point, I think, in regards to this game. This is a game marketed almost entirely on the back of mystery. This is a game in which Sean Murray and the Hello Games team were almost obsessively protecting it prior to its release. Yes, they had certainly shown some limited gameplay, but quotes from Sean Murray prior to release were practically pleading with people not to spoil the game for others by showing leaked pre-release copies. We've spent years filling No Man's Sky with surprises. You've spent years waiting. Please don't spoil it for yourselves. Sean Murray on the 29th of July 2016. Take a break from reading about it and picking videos apart. You can experience it for yourself so soon, he said. This is in response to leaked videos and early unboxings, and there were various other tweets along those lines, including a statement that they did not want reviewers publishing footage of copies that had been leaked or acquired prior to street date because it didn't properly represent the form in which the game would take on its release day. As it turned out, of course, it probably would have, and would have given people quite a lot of information as regards to the various performance problems and crash issues that the game continues to have, both on PC and on PlayStation 4. It's always a worrying sign when companies decide to deny information to the consumer. Review copies of this game were not given to PC users at all. There was speculation as to why that would be. There was belief that the game was being polished up to the very last minute, which was supposedly substantiated by the fact that there was going to be a day one patch. Regardless of that, though, the day one patch was actually applied to the PlayStation version's launch several days before the PC version even came out, and yet review code was still not issued to those on PC. Bearing in mind the launch date of the game, you can certainly understand why, and I've encouraged people to be wary of games that do not issue pre-release review code, especially on the PC platform, because that can, not always, but can be very much indicative of a rocky launch. an unoptimized game, something that is littered with problems. We've had plenty of examples of that occurring, and very few examples of games where that has not been the case. The only ones in recent memory that I can think of on the PC platform were Doom and Shadow of Mordor, and it's worth bearing in mind that Shadow of Mordor did have console review code available, just not for PC. The obsessive secrecy in regards to No Man's Sky is a little bit strange to me, because it is a game that is supposedly based on a procedural algorithm, meaning that everything that you find as a player is most likely going to be completely different to what somebody else finds. Now, while I can understand the desire to hide the various handcrafted secrets and the narrative which can be found in the game, it's worth noting that No Man's Sky does include a narrative. There is lore, there is backstory if you wish to go and look for it. If the vast majority of the content is procedurally generated, then one has to wonder what there even is to spoil. To me, the answer to that would be, well, nothing. And the deliberate obfuscation of the game seems to be more of a marketing technique than anything else, rather than genuine concern for the experience of the players going into it. Indeed, I don't believe that uninformed consumers going into a game blind is generally a good thing, while of course storyline spoilers should be avoided at all costs. A well-informed consumer is, in all circumstances, a good thing. So let's sum up what we have talked about so far. We spoke a little bit about the initial unveiling of the game. We spoke about an insane amount of hype building from 2013 VGX unveiling onwards. And we have spoken to some extent, and I think we could go on for hours about this if we really wanted to, the vague statements made in interviews and via social media by the creators of the game themselves, which seem to contribute to an air of mystery and mystique surrounding the game and resulted in players filling in the blanks in their own imagination and pushing expectations to stratospheric levels. There's one other element of this that I think contributes to the perfect storm of hype, and that's this concept that I've mentioned in a couple of videos before called the desperation genre. It's the idea that there are certain genres of games that are not particularly well populated by complete experiences that truly realize the potential of the genre. I'm not talking about something like a first-person shooter. I mean, there's so many of those, and you can argue that various shooters within that genre do very much realize the potential of what that genre is capable of doing. It's a very well-developed genre that's been fleshed out over the course of a couple of decades. There are games like real-time strategy, puzzle platformers, all sorts of things like that. Again, very well fleshed out, lots of great examples within the genre and a clear framework as to how they should actually be developed. And then we have a couple of emergent genres that could be considered to be the holy grail, something that a huge number of people really, really want in their lives. They really want to play, and yet don't actually contain complete and great examples of the potential of that genre. One of the biggest desperation genres that exists is survival. Now, you can argue that survival in itself is not really a genre, that survival consists of a bundle of mechanics and the concept that you are going to be constantly fighting to survive against the environment and the elements. Survival games can contain crafting. Some survival games do not contain crafting, although that is a hallmark of the genre since most of them do. Some survival games are procedurally generated, an awful lot of them are procedurally generated, but not all of them, of course. Some survival games involve combat mechanics, some games do not involve combat mechanics within this so-called genre, if that's what you can call it. But one way or the other, there is one common theme. If you accept that survival is a genre, then I think you also have to accept that as a genre, survival is underdeveloped, and it is full of incomplete games. As to where exactly the survival genre kicked off, it's hard to say. It goes certainly way, way further back than a game like Minecraft, no doubt about that. There were games in the 80s and 90s that attempted this. But you can argue that in the modern era, Minecraft is probably the reason that this genre exists and is as popular as it is. The survival mode of Minecraft ended up being perhaps more popular than the creators could have possibly anticipated. What could have been a game merely about sandbox creation actually did become a game about survival and the collection of resources in order to do so. Do me a favor, go onto YouTube for a second and look at the sheer popularity of Minecraft videos involving the term First Night. Yogscast, Lewis, and Simon, 16 million views. Xbox One, How to Minecraft First Night from Stampy Longhead, 7.8 million views. Minecraft Pocket Edition, My First Night, 3.4 million views. How to Survive Your First Night tutorial, 8.7 million views. The survival aspect of Minecraft is absolutely massive, and I have no doubt that this certainly had a lot to do with spawning parts of this genre. The other game that really pushed this genre into the limelight and really spurred its popularity and people's hunger and desire for games within it would be the mod DayZ for the game Arma 2. Now, of course, we know that DayZ is a standalone product now, and it's still very much in development. It is actually symptomatic of the issues that this genre actually has. But in comparison to a game like Minecraft, which is primarily player survival versus the environment, DayZ was player survival versus other players. The zombies really being more of a distraction and an obstacle versus the real threat in that game, which were the other people. And that spawned a huge number of imitators, all of which are unfinished. There are actually very few finished games within this survival genre, if you can believe that. One of the only ones that I can even think of would be Don't Starve. That's a finished game. That's a released game. Almost every other game within the survival genre on Steam is in early access. The amount of systems that people expect from the survival genre far exceed most other games. An awful lot of survival games have huge sandbox elements, the ability to construct custom buildings, the ability to create your own items, the ability to do so in cooperation with other players in a world with persistence. I mean, what you're describing here is a set of incredibly advanced features that prior to that really existed only in MMOs. That's what survival multiplayer games in particular have become, in my opinion. They are the new MMO. That's where a lot of the MMO audience migrated to, because they could get that element of exploration of a new world along with the PvP elements and that cooperative PvE survival aspect. But they could do it without a subscription fee, they could do it without the usual theme park of quests and regular experience bars and all sorts of things like that, and they could also do so in a world that allowed them to make their own stuff, make a permanent mark on their world, which outside a few examples in MMOs is fairly uncommon. There's a reason why it's uncommon, because it's bloody hard to do, and that's probably why the vast majority of survival games are still in early access, because they're still trying to make that happen, and they are still filled with bugs and flaws and missing features as a direct result of taking on such a gigantic challenge. Let's be frank here, No Man's Sky is a survival game. The developers might not want to admit it, in fact they begrudgingly did so in the very same Eurogamer article that I quoted earlier, which is entitled, by the way, So What Do You Actually Do in No Man's Sky? That's the answer, Sean Murray said, that you need to put No Man's Sky in a box, and the next thing will be, and it's a first-person survival action game, or something like that, and then we can all go home. That's the thing that I know you need to be able to convey to somebody, that there are classic game loop elements, and genuinely we're trying to convey that with everything that we've released so far. But then, of course, it is surrounded by paragraphs and paragraphs of speaking about how special an experience it is, and they were trying to create something that was entirely different to most games. Indeed, there's another quote in this article which some would consider even a little bit pretentious, but it's not entirely unwarranted. He said, "This makes me sound very jaded, but I'm not. I do absolutely love games, but it's very predictable. I know when I see a screenshot exactly what the game is going to play like, probably how long it's going to be, and how it's going to finish, and we want it to be more open-ended than that." That to me isn't merely a statement describing what they hoped No Man's Sky would be. I think that's something that everybody who is currently developing a open-world sandbox survival game is attempting to achieve. They want to be the king of that emerging genre that doesn't really have a king yet. It doesn't have a king because there's not really even a kingdom as it stands. There's nothing to rule over. It's a set of ideas that are coming to fruition in a genre that is perhaps the most ambitious in the history of gaming. Make no mistake about it, No Man's Sky is part of that genre, despite its protests, it is a first-person sandbox survival game. The sheer number of survival mechanics, the amount of meter management, the amount of resource management, the amount of mundane, repetitive mining and resource gathering that you have to do to even stay alive in that game is proof positive of the fact that it is a survival title. Now, if it was just a survival title, then the expectations would have been high enough. The expectations of survival games are ludicrous. The expected feature set for them is beyond the capability of the vast majority of developers, even given years of development time and feedback. But this game went one stage further and tapped into another desperation genre, that being the open-world sandbox space game. The weird thing about No Man's Sky is that the actual spaceflight elements are fairly basic. Compared to games such as Elite Dangerous, the X series, even MMOs like EVE, or previous titles within this genre that was, for the most part, very popular within the 90s and sort of died off as the console era really came in and those games simply didn't really work on those devices. There's a whole other group of people that have been desperately looking for the perfect open-world sandbox space game. And there aren't all that many modern examples of it, and those that do exist are either plagued with problems, years away from release, such as Star Citizen, or extremely complex and difficult to get into, such as the X series. The idea of marrying open-world infinite space exploration with mainstream accessibility has perhaps been a pipe dream for a while, and it's something that No Man's Sky certainly attempted to achieve, but in doing that, it put itself in an impossible situation in which it couldn't possibly fulfill all of the expectations of these different groups of people. There are elements of design which preclude appealing to everybody. It's impossible to do so in any form of media, but if you overcomplicate the spaceflight aspect of the title, let's say you go full-on Elite or X with big simulation aspects, then you end up excluding a large number of more casual players. And of course, if you simplify those mechanics to the point where they really don't have an awful lot of depth at all, then you piss off those that were looking for a more in-depth space experience. Now, No Man's Sky didn't necessarily promise that, but it also didn't deny that it would feature it either. No Man's Sky, to me, is a giant blank slate upon which people projected their hopes and dreams, and the developers did nothing to really dispel that. It tapped into not one but two different desperation genres, and despite being fundamentally a niche game, it was marketed as anything but that. It seems to me that every time somebody looked at No Man's Sky, they saw a reflection of their own hopes and dreams when it comes to gaming, as opposed to what the game actually was. And that frustrating lack of detail did nothing but contribute to that. All of that said, however, as much time as I've really spent talking about the lack of specifics that led to this particular situation, it is important not to dismiss all potential responsibility when it comes to the people that supported and pre-ordered this game. The people that were responsible for continuing to hype it up over the course of a number of years and didn't actually have any professional or commercial reason to do so. They were not monetarily incentivized to do so. In fact, quite the opposite. They had given money to the company, not the other way around, and yet they felt the need to justify that pre-order. They felt the need to evangelize this game. And evangelism is a great term to describe this because it is something that exists a great deal on the internet these days, whether it be for a person, whether it be for a product. It's worryingly cult-like behavior. Product evangelism exists for all forms of media, whether it be music, movies, books, TV shows, but it's certainly very strong within the gaming scene, and that's probably got a lot to do with the fact that many of those people engaged in that don't have anything better to do. They have a lot of spare time, and they can produce an awful lot of content on the internet, whether it just be written posts or whether it be as complex as full-on websites and communities based around this game, which isn't out yet. The religious fervor for it surpasses anything that I've personally ever seen for a game that people weren't able to get their hands on. There are some very strong fan bases for various titles. Minecraft has a very strong fan base, but ultimately that game was available from an alpha state, and you could clearly see where it was going. Star Citizen has a very strong and very zealous fan base, but ultimately you can play elements of it, and it seems to be rather clear as to what that game is going to be, and its development has been modular, and the information seems to be accurate. No Man's Sky really had none of that. Nobody could play it. Nobody really knew an awful lot about it. And yet, for some reason, unbelievable faith was put in it. Faith that was, for many people, certainly dashed. Plenty of people were disappointed with it. But ultimately, I think it's an important lesson to remember. It may not be the first time that we've seen this, but this may very well be the most intense, the biggest example, the most hardline, the most zealous that I think I've ever seen when it comes to the games industry. And my hope is that that doesn't happen again. I hope this is not a sign of things to come, and more a wake-up call to those that would get so engrossed in hype culture that they start to define their identities by their loose connection to this title. It's a problem that I've seen online in every walk of life. It is not unique to gaming by any stretch of the imagination. When teenage girls gang up on each other over Twitter because they like the wrong boy band, that is an example of people that define components of their identity via the products that they like. Gaming is obviously full of that, but it is absolutely everywhere. And the problem with defining even an aspect of your personality by something that you like is that criticism of that product appears to you to be criticism of you personally. In reality, of course, it absolutely is not, and it's a fairly unreasonable assumption to make. In fact, I find it to be a very, very harmful attitude. It directly impedes reasonable discussion. It completely torpedoes any sort of sensible discourse, because as soon as you get to that point, you are incapable of rationally discussing a product because you've started to define yourself by its very existence. And it sounds insane when you say it out loud, but there are an awful lot of people that do it. Fandom in and of itself is not inherently harmful. Fandom taken to an extreme absolutely is. We saw it with No Man's Sky, we've seen plenty of other examples, but what I'm hoping for is that No Man's Sky will be something of a watershed moment. There's been a great deal of bitterness surrounding this title, and there are plenty of arguments still happening to this day. There are people that even define themselves by how much they hate No Man's Sky, and they're so very happy that it didn't turn out to be as good as other people had hoped for. I mean, if anything, that is equally pathetic. The idea of the zealous anti-fan versus the zealous fan. Both are problematic, both are utterly unhelpful, and both are utterly unhealthy. But despite all of that, despite the battleground that currently exists surrounding this game, I hope that the message that people can take away from it is please temper your expectations. When a game offers vague promises, ask for specifics. When a game promises the universe, assume that it won't be able to fulfill that promise. When a website can't shut up about a game that's years away from release, treat it with fair and reasonable skepticism. There's no need to be horribly negative. Nihilism isn't required. You don't need excessive cynicism. But what you do need is a sense of perspective. The expectations surrounding No Man's Sky were impossible to fulfill. The ideas behind No Man's Sky were certainly brave, but obviously outside of the skill set and resources of a small indie development studio whose previous projects involved fun but nonetheless limited spiritual successors to Excitebike. These are developers that enthusiastically, bravely, but perhaps foolishly seem to have bit off more than they can chew and promised more than they could actually deliver. These are perhaps developers that got lost within their own development bubble, that started drinking their own Kool-Aid. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but perhaps the developers themselves lost perspective as much as we did when it came to this game. And to a great extent, their passion is admirable, and to some extent, the passion of those that followed them is too. It was great to see positivity and hope regarding a game like this, and yet, unfortunately, that turned to anger and bitter disappointment after the release of the title. So perhaps it wasn't such a good idea in the first place. Ultimately, the developers are at fault for delivering a subpar experience, and you won't be able to change that. Hopefully, later down the line, No Man's Sky ends up realizing some of those fantastic visions that we saw in the trailer of 2013. Hopefully, it's able to fulfill, with future content updates, more expectations than it already has. But for me, No Man's Sky will, for a long time, represent the largest case of an utter abandonment of common sense and skepticism from a large portion of the gaming community in favor of no man's pie in the sky. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And I'll see you next time.